What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video. Are you looking to build a super cheap gaming PC as we head into 2022? If the answer is yes, you're in the right place. In this video, I'll be talking you through all the components that I've selected to build an uber budget gaming PC build, but still a system that's super upgradable and really well future-proofed. More on those a little bit later. I'll not only be assembling the system in this video, but also testing out its performance later, so hang tight for that one. Let's dive into the video though, after a quick ad from today's video sponsor. Corsair's M65 RGB Ultra Wireless builds upon the legendary M65 design with the latest Corsair Slipstream wireless tech and much more. With a 26,000 dpi Corsair Marksman sensor that can be adjusted in dpi steps as small as 1, this mouse means business. Adjustable weight allows you to find your perfect center of gravity, while Omron optical switches deliver hyper-fast and precise responses. Everything you love about the M65 in 2021, now wireless. Check it out at the links in the description below. Let's dive straight into the video though, and kick things off by looking at some of our core components first up. And by that, I mean our processor, our RAM, or our memory, and of course the motherboard. At the heart of this build is the MSI B550M Pro VDH. This is one of the cheapest motherboards on the market that I'd actually recommend people buy, and there's a few key reasons for that. Not only do you get support for the latest Gen 4 NVMe drives, but you also get 4 RAM DIMM slots, overclocking support for your processor, and a black rather than a brown PCB, making it actually quite stealthy as far as aesthetics go. It also has display outputs on the rear panel, important for our CPU or APU choice today. As we all know, buying a graphics card full stop over the last year or so has been next to impossible, making AMD's new APU chips, which look to combine a CPU and a GPU into one unit, a really tangible option. Now, to be really clear with you all right out of the doors, this isn't going to be a system that smashes through Cyberpunk at 60 frames per second, and instead lends itself more closely to games like CSGO, Valorant, Fortnite, and even Apex Legends. Titles that are undoubtedly less demanding and more first-person shooter focused. You'll still get good mileage with racing sim games as well, and we'll cover the exact performance figures later on in the video, so hang tight for those ones. Now, with this chip basically combining your traditional CPU and GPU into one unit, you'll need to pick yourself up some pretty decent RAM or memory. That's because normally a GPU has its own RAM, and in this build, our APU has to share the systems. 16GB of Corsair's Vengeance RGB RT will do the trick very nicely. 2 RAM DIMMs on a 4 DIMM slot motherboard gives you dual channel performance. Essentially, this gives it more memory bandwidth, and the 3600 MHz speed is what I would recommend most people go for when it comes to a Ryzen processor. Installing the memory in any build is pretty simple. Go ahead and find the gold contact strip on the bottom of the DIMM and match the notch on this strip up to the notch on your motherboard. This board's got 4 slots and we'll be using the 2nd and 4th. This is due to your motherboard manual, which recommends different slots for different configurations. As a rule of thumb, basically any build you're going to do with 2 DIMMs uses slots 2 and slots 4. Once you've done this, we can go ahead and install the CPU cooler. One major advantage of Ryzen processors is this bad boy, the AMD stock cooler, often referred to as the Wraith or Spire. Now, this comes included for free with your Ryzen APU and does a really good job of keeping the CPU nice and cool. Aftermarket coolers like the Cooler Master 212 and something like this one from Be Quiet are also great options, but if you're really counting the pennies or the cents, as my American viewers would say, then this is the unit for you. Typically, these will come with pre-applied thermal paste, meaning you won't need to bother applying your own. But because I've used this cooler and CPU before, I need to drop a dab of fresh thermal paste on. You can then nice and easily pop the cooler along the 4 holes around the CPU itself and grab yourself a Phillips head screwdriver. You want to screw in each of these screws a little bit at a time. Don't finish them off completely, as that can place undue strain on the processor. Essentially, a little bit of screwing on each corner until the processor is nice and secure. Don't forget as well to install your 4-pin PWM fan header. This plugs up to the top of the motherboard and allows the fan itself to actually spin. You can configure the speed and all that stuff in your motherboard's BIOS a bit later. Before any of that though, we can go ahead and move this now completed motherboard assembly, as we refer to it, over into the case choice today. We've done as much of the build outside the case as possible, and it's now time to introduce to you all AeroCool's Quantum Mesh. Now, when it comes to picking a good case for any build, it's an overwhelming task. With hundreds of different chassis available, just which one should you pick? Well, we've made a video talking about the top 10 cases that I like, and I'm going to do a follow-up for 2022, so make sure to get subscribed for that. But this here is one of the best value options on the market. Coming in at around $30 or $25 on some offers I've seen, this chassis is incredible value. And while it is a little bit simple, it's a bit bare bones, it does the job for a build like this really, really nicely. There are a few key features that make this case an awesome choice. Lots of ventilation at the front with RGB fans that are addressable, support inside for up to a full-size ATX or micro ATX motherboard, and of course a beautiful tempered glass side panel that allows you to admire the hard work of your build when it's situated on a desk. Plus, it's also super compact and won't take up a great deal of room. For this next step, I'm going to lay the case down flat on the table, as this will make it undoubtedly quite a bit easier to work with. And I'm also going to go ahead and remove the front and rear side panels at this stage, once again allowing the case to be a bit more open and intuitive. It's at this stage of proceedings that we can then grab our motherboard and pop this into the case. You can do this nice and easily by sliding it in, but wait, there's one thing on budget motherboards you need to do first, and that is install this, your motherboard's rear I/O shield. We're going to install this down here, where we've got a rectangular cutout at the rear of the case. Slide it in nice and carefully, and then with the audio port situated towards the bottom, it should just leave you with a satisfying click sound. You can then be a little bit more hasty and slide the motherboard in. It's going to pop through the ports on the rear I/O shield, that's how you know it's perfectly lined up, and over the standoffs that are installed in the case. You can then go ahead and secure it down through each of these standoff holes, which hopefully you can see nice and clearly using our fancy overhead camera angle. Once the motherboard is installed, there aren't actually that many components left to go, but one of those is the power supply, Corsair's CX650F. Now, for a build like this, I talked earlier about future-proofing. The Ryzen 5 5600 processor is pretty incredible in its own right, and the addition of great graphics are obviously a huge bonus. But what it does mean is that you could swap out the GPU and add in something like an RTX 3060 at a later date and not actually witness any bottlenecking. That means the APU will just turn into CPU mode, not using its built-in graphics, providing you a really, really great upgrade path. In order to make this upgrade path a reality though, you do need to pick up a power supply with enough wattage to power any future upgrades. That's not to say you should go silly and spend $150 on a PSU, but picking up a 650 watt 80 plus bronze certified unit like this one is equally not a bad idea. I'll be installing a few of our cables into the power supply and then into the motherboard. The first of these is our 24 pin motherboard power connector, which just adds on to the largest connectors on the power supply itself. I'll also be adding on one of these, a SATA power connector. These are what will power up our RGB fans in the case and any storage drives like hard drives or 2.5-inch SSDs, and these go here on the power supply, just below actually, where we previously installed the motherboard cable. Finally, the last cable that we need to install today is this. Now this right here is our 8-pin CPU power connector. This makes sure our CPU has got plenty of power for not only day-to-day operation, but also overclocking, and plugs up to the PCIe/CPU power adapters on our power supply. We can then go ahead and install the unit into the case itself. A fan up or fan down orientation in terms of the power supply, either like this or like this, are both going to be suitable. But for this video, I think I'm going to go fan down. Go ahead and slide this into the rear of the case and then secure it down through the 4 screw holes at the rear. That's here, 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 and here. Lovely stuff. Once you've gone ahead and installed it, you then just need to plug up the other end of those power cables to your motherboard. The first of which will go to the largest 24-pin connector on the right-hand side of the board, and then of course the CPU, which goes to the 4 or 8-pin connector. It's 8 in our case on the top left-hand side. With that done, there's only a couple things really left to do. Alongside our storage, it's also now a good time to install some of the front panel connectors. These are the cables which connect the top of the case to the motherboard. The largest of these is the USB 3 front panel cable. It's notched and will only go in one way around. We've also got a USB 2 connector to power the singular USB 2 port on the top of the case and has a pin missing. So once again, there's only one correct orientation here. We've also got HD audio, which typically goes to the bottom left of the motherboard, has a different pin blocked out and looks oddly familiar to USB 2. This powers up and connects up our headphone and mic jacks on top of the chassis. Finally, you've got your JFP1 connectors. These are the fiddly small little pins with plus and minuses that will pop a diagram on your screen now to help things along with. They are the most complicated of all the cables in a PC build, but they make sure the power button on top of the chassis works as planned. They're actually not that difficult to install if you take things slowly. With those in, there's one more thing left to go, and that's the storage. Now, for a build like this, storage is probably the most difficult part. I don't want to sit here and recommend an expensive Gen 4 SSD like the Firecuda 530, because the money is better spent elsewhere. But equally, you probably shouldn't pick up a hard drive for a build like this, as that's going to be really slow, really sluggish, and take a while to boot into Windows. A cheaper SSD of either the SATA or the M.2 variety is a good happy medium, with this 500GB Seagate Firecuda Gaming 120 working a charm. SATA drives are actually quick enough if you get decent ones like this one, but if you've got more cash, an NVMe unit is definitely a good spend of money as well. We'll be using one of our SATA power connectors we plugged up to the power supply earlier, that's this connector right here, to give our drive power. And it installs really nice and easily. A little bit stiff on this drive, I must admit, but we got there in the end. I'll also be just connecting up a SATA data cable, that's one of these, with one end of the cable going to the SSD itself, and then the other through our motherboard tray, and into one of these awkwardly positioned side-mounted SATA data cables on the right-hand side of this MSI board. Once we've done that though, we can just tidy up the cables, whack those side panels on, and then boot the machine up. We're going to test out not only the gaming performance, but also have a fiddle with the RGB and see how good it looks, in the typical style here on the channel. I'll rejoin you in just a few moments for the gaming benchmarks, but first, make sure to get subscribed and enjoy that montage. Nice. Now that we've seen how good this system looks, it's time to delve into the performance figures. Something that's important in any build, but arguably even more important in this system, where the budget nature means you're more concerned about the exact frame rates you can realistically achieve. We tested a wide range of titles, and we're going to look at these title by title, kicking things off with GTA 5. At 1080p medium sort of normal settings, we got 62 frames per second on average, with 56 and 50 for the 90 and 99th percentile results, which actually really impressed me on our 5600G. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5, and this is one of the newest games to be tested on the 5600G. We managed to achieve 53 frames per second with our settings at 1080p tuned down a bit, which is still a very respectable frame rate. Racing games are fine at the 40 to 50 mark, so these numbers are very solid. We also tested out Apex Legends, a game where we managed to achieve 51 frames per second on average at 1080p, with some of our settings tuned down to low. This was a very decent result actually, and it shows just how far the APUs have come as far as frame rate goes. If you're looking for frame rate on this little APU though, Valorant, the next title, is what you're after. At 1080p with the settings set to normal or medium, we managed to get 93 frames per second on average, with 86 and 73 for the 90 and 99th percentiles. But the good results don't end there. Fortnite at 1080p competitive settings, aka everything tuned down to low but the render distance set to far, rounds off our benchmark results nicely, with just shy of 80 frames per second on average. As I alluded to earlier, the 5600G is all about the games you play in. For fast first-person shooter esports titles and games that sit in the realms of Valorant and CSGO, it's a perfect fit. But for you Cyberpunk fans out there, this might not quite be the hardware for you. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to get subscribed to see more from us. Thanks for tuning in though, and as always, we'll see you in the next GeekaWhat video.